A pair of Democratic senators and former governors of Virginia, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, both are members of the Senate Budget Committee. Both, by the way, are taking part in the ceremonies here this morning to honor the George Washington Library. Welcome to both of you, governors and senators, to you both. Senator Warner, I want to start with you. You've worked a lot with Senator Corker. You obviously have become, I think, pretty good friends with him. Watching him on the Senate floor yesterday, how divided in your mind does it appear Senate Republicans are?
I think there's a lot of frustration amongst a lot of Republicans. You know, that there's a time to fight about Obamacare. There's a time also to make sure the functions of government proceed. If we don't get something done, you know, we're going to ask all our soldiers and sailors to report to duty on Tuesday, but they're not going to get paid, as well as millions being sent home without a paycheck as well. That does nothing for the economy. And I think there's a real growing sense that this kind of, you know, my way or the highway, we got to get everything we want or nothing, is really breaking apart not only the Senate Republicans, but has got frustrations across the board. You know, Senator Kaine, if the House does do what they're going to do and sends back a continuing resolution until, I guess, what we're talking about, November 15th, that includes this medical device tax deal and this issue with congressional members, is that something you could support?
You know, Chuck, they shouldn't do it, and it's just the wrong way to do business. To give you an example, we could take the bill that we have now and amend it and send it to the House and say, we'll fund government if you'll pass our farm bill. We passed the farm bill 2 years in a row with 80 votes. You ought to pass our farm bill. We care about the farm bill, but it's wrong to wrap it up with the shutdown of government. We ought to continue government forward, and then we'll debate about the farm bill, we'll debate about Obamacare, we'll debate about immigration reform, but you shouldn't wrap it up with a threat of a government shutdown. That's just, it's dealing in bad faith, and it's hurting Americans and the economy.
That, but if it's Monday and this bill's, you know, sitting there, I mean,
well, let me give you. You asked about the medical device tax. We've already cast a vote in the Senate on
pretty big number.
Willingness to find an alternative to the medical device tax. It's in the budget. The House will not sit down at a budget conference table with us. That was passed 6 months ago this week, and they've not been willing to sit down. That's where you have the battle about the medical device tax, but you don't do it around government shutdown.
And let's just face it. This debate should be about getting our country's balance sheet right. 17 trillion in debt. It goes up $4 billion a day. We got to deal with revenues. We got to deal with entitlements, and we can't even get to a budget conference. So,
do you think you know, one of the reasons, you know, and it is a reminder, this budget conference, right? And House Republicans successfully forced Senate Democrats forced you guys to go do a budget, and it was a pretty partisan vote on the budget. Do you think there was any chance that there was consensus that could have been done
I still think there is, because last fall, I brought my so-called gang of 8 here. We spent 2 or 3 days with Erskine Bowles here.
Right? What's right here in Mount Vernon, right? Yeah.
You know, trying to hammer out an arrangement. I think there are, at least in the Senate, a majority of Democrats and Republicans who would still do a grand bargain. We got to get the folks in the room to make that happen. We've not been so successful so far.
When you talk to your fellow Republicans on the Senate Budget Committee, I feel like, and this is sort of one of the frustrations as a reporter, you hear one thing behind the scenes, and then you see that they have to do. How much do you feel like some of these Senate Republicans on the Budget Committee feel party pressure?
They do feel pressure, but you're seeing it on the floor of the Senate that when it comes to let's stick with the party to defund government, you've got, you know, the vast majority of the Senate Republicans saying, include me out. You know, we're not for government shutdown. We're not for default on the debt. That's why Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and just a few others, they've been making their case, but they haven't been winning support from their Senate Republican colleagues, because even if they support them on the issue of the medical device tax or the Affordable Care Act, they don't support threatening government shutdown. They don't support defaulting on American
We've seen that movie before.
You know, do you think it was a mistake a couple years ago that there was a negotiation over the debt limit? Do you think that in hindsight the president's sitting there going, you know what, he's been making this argument, you don't negotiate with hostage takers. You hear this argument from the administration, but they did once.
No great nation, no major industrial nation has ever defaulted on its debt. In recent history, the only nation that ever comes to mind that defaulted was Argentina, and folks there lost about 60% of their total net worth in a couple
everybody
of days.
knows this is a bad idea.
Bad idea.
But
I was a business guy.
I was just going to say, but was it a mistake a couple years ago negotiating that's how it happened?
Well, look, in retrospect, you might look back and say it. Even though a deal was reached, you know, the stock market was affected, et cetera. But what was really dangerous at the time is that you had members of Congress who were saying, who cares if we default on the debt? And And there was a strong belief that there was a sizable number of members of Congress who would have let the economy go over the cliff. And in that circumstance, do you negotiate and try to at least salvage something? I think it's hard to fault those who did it, but we learned something as a result. And what we learned is, we can talk about any issue we want, but we shouldn't combine it with government shutdown or defaulting on America's debt. Constitution, 14th Amendment says the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. It's unconstitutional to try to screw around with that like this.
So maybe you should get all of our colleagues to come down here and also
well, I was just going to say, let's
Washington's farewell address.
I was just going to say, and I want to transition to the library, but I am curious, we are here today. We're 14 miles from the Potomac, which feels, a lot farther away. I'm sure
on the Virginia side.
On the Virginia side of things. What are some of the lessons that folks, if you did get members of Congress here at this library, that they should take away from Washington?
Well, I think, you go to Washington's farewell address, constantly cited, where he laid out concerns about the dangers of party politics. You can talk about some of its I'm doing my little talk today where he says, we've got debt and deficit, but taxes are a necessary evil. Washington was a fiscal conservative, but you had to pay your bills, and somehow, and put country first. Somehow that seems to be lost by, I would say, some folks in both parties.
The other thing about Washington that's so powerful is just his personal civility. I mean, he talked about the dangers of partisanship, but his rules for living all emphasize the personal.
That little book of rules for living.
We all ought to keep it on our desk because the civility and the need to listen to one another. He warned against regional factionalism, that we ought to be one nation and think of ourselves as one nation, not as different regions. And those words, the only thing that's odd about Washington today that seems dated is the way he expressed it all in a very humble way. You don't have a lot of people in politics doing that these days.
No.
But the wisdom he was offering speaks to today's issues.
You brought up the It is interesting. I mean, this is why he and Jefferson split. Jefferson wanted to be there was a political faction, and he seemed to split with them over the idea of what turned into our two-party system. I mean, it was born basically right after Washington.
Federalists and the beginnings of the Democrat-Republicans.
But I guess, is there, what other parts of this library do you think that folks should take away from this as far as history is concerned?
Well, I think you'll see, the Fred Smith family, who's been such a major donor.
By the way, this is not the FedEx Fred Smith. I've had people say this is another Fred Smith, but anyway, go ahead.
But I think they should come down and get the libraries more for scholars, but see Mount Vernon, see a major part of our history, good, the bad. The fact that
he was
the challenge around slavery is part of this, and that's only been the last 30 years. That part of Washington's life has even been brought. That true part of American history has also been brought here to it.
We've been slow on that history with and there is sort of this, everybody wants to be uncomfortable about it because you want to feel patriotic about the Revolutionary War, but you cannot ignore the issue of slavery.
No, you can't. But, I think it's patriotic. If you look at the Washingtons, Jeffersons, best men of their days, they weren't perfect, and we've gotten better. And there's something patriotic about being able to say we can be better tomorrow than we are today. Even our greatest leaders had flaws, but as a nation, we're better today than we were in the past, and that means tomorrow we'll be better than we are today. We can still hope for progress and learning and growing, and studying Washington, will show us that.
Talking about the power of the presidency, the biggest decision George Washington made was not seeking a third term. What would America look like today if Washington had basically served till death?
I think it would look like an awful lot of other countries around that are in name republics or democracies, but as we see pass along almost with family heirs. Look around the number of countries across the Middle East, Syria, for example, where in name it's a democracy, but it's passed from father to son. So I think he set that precedence, that humility, that recognition that we do better when we act with compromise. I mean, we talk about Washington. We also have to remember the Constitution, which all of these guys cite was the result of the Great Compromise. It was the Great Compromise.
They could have shut down the Republic. They could have shut down the Republic, split it into two. Who knows what would have looked like.
Well, compromise is the blood of the organism of government. I mean, if you set up three branches and then the legislative branch, you have two houses, and something's got to get through both. The framers really believed, Madison really believed in crafting the Constitution, that there had to be compromise. And, that's probably what we're most missing today, is that belief that compromise is a good thing. Remember, Lincoln's hero was Henry Clay, and his nickname was the Great Compromiser, and that was a compliment in the 1840s and 50s. It wouldn't be a compliment today, sadly.
What do you say? I'm going to do a little bit of politics here. But what do you say when people say Virginia's changed? What does that mean when people say Virginia's changed? It's not what it was even when you first ran for governor.
Well, I think Virginia's changed because, you know, we're nationally recognized now as, when Tim and I were governor, best managed state. I think we regained that attribution recently, best state for business, or for the fact that we got recognized for our educational system. I think Virginia has become kind of more forward-leaning. For a long time, Virginia spent a lot of time looking backwards, and we had a great history, but not as much forward-looking. And I think we're a diverse state that politically is also getting a lot more competitive.
It's the single most competitive state in the country.
And Chuck, I'd say we've changed back to what we were from 1770 to 1840. You know, we had the most electoral votes in the nation in the early years of the Republic, but we went into an eclipse because of slavery, because of Jim Crow, because of massive resistance. We were not on the main stage with the spotlight on. We've actually gone back to being, as you say, competitive, a battleground state. People kind of view us again in sort of a national light, and that's good for us.
It's returning.
State,
it's returning
to the Virginia of Washington State.
I think we also, though, and something I think Tim and I are both proud of, is we actually tried to get stuff done.
Yeah.
You know, rather than the other side all the time for the problems.
Mark Warner, Tim Kaine, thank you both for doing this together. This is kind of a neat site here.